This alien planet is brought to you by Campfire. Campfire is an online tool suite that offers everything you need to write up and organize your stories and world-building projects. Campfire includes a bevy of modules to let you catalog all the details of your world-building, including character sheets, relationship webs, timelines, story arcs, maps, species, languages, and much more. And you can also find in-depth tutorials and free resources on all sorts of writing and world-building topics on Campfire's blog. Plus, you can share your work and collaborate with others, and even read and purchase books published on the platform. Campfire's free version already comes with more than enough features for most projects, but to unlock even more, Campfire has a flexible pricing structure where you only pay for the modules you need, ranging from subscriptions as low as a few cents a month to lifetime purchases. And a massive thanks to Campfire for sponsoring this series for all these years, and for helping to make absurdly long videos like this one possible. To sign up for Campfire or to learn more, check out the link in the description. In the last episode, the planet Tira 292b underwent the greatest cataclysm in its history, in which the vast majority of terrestrial and marine life was wiped out, and from the ashes arose a new world teeming with a totally new assemblage of clades. But now, 30 million years after the mass extinction, 420 million years after the emergence of the first anthostomes and polypods, somewhere among the dizzying profusion of new diversity, one species will end up in the right place at the right time to stumble upon a unique set of adaptations that will let its descendants reshape the entire world. Before we go any further, be aware that much of what we're about to discuss is very difficult to navigate with any certainty, especially when it comes to making firm, universally applicable predictions. This entire series is based on the premise that we can speculate about how life might evolve on other planets based on what we observe on Earth. But when it comes to Sapience, there's a lot about the situation on Earth that's not yet fully understood. Neurobiology, psychology, and human evolution are still the subject of ample research, and cognition in other animals is notoriously challenging to study and quantify, making speculation about Sapience difficult and prone to personal biases. This isn't helped by the fact that for much of its history, the study of Sapience has been plagued by anthropocentrism, as humans have always been keen to think of themselves as the most intelligent and advanced form of life. And although modern biology has largely abandoned this idea, discussions of Sapience still often fall victim to teleology, describing traits in terms of their eventual purpose rather than the selective pressures that prompted their evolution in the first place, as if every adaptation that occurred over the course of human evolution came about specifically to make Sapience possible. But this overlooks the fact that evolution can't plan ahead and has no end goal. It's easy to fall for the trap of thinking of natural selection as a process of advancement, that species always get bigger, better, and smarter over time. But in reality, evolution only serves to make species better adapted to their immediate environment, which may not necessarily involve any increase in strength, intelligence, or even complexity. It may be tempting to think of animals like sponges and jellyfish as being primitive and lowly organisms, but their body plans are so effective that they've remained virtually unchanged for over 500 million years, and their lifestyle of passively straining the water for food doesn't require any intelligence or behavioral complexity, so higher cognitive abilities would just be a waste of energy. With this in mind, it's fundamentally important to recognize that Sapience is in no way the pinnacle of evolution, nor is it an inevitable outcome of natural selection, but is in fact no more guided or special than any other adaptation, just a curious quirk of the evolutionary pathway that humans happen to have taken. But this begs the question of what Sapience actually is, which proves to be very difficult to pin down precisely. Historically, the term intelligence has been used to describe the same concept, but in its broadest sense, intelligence is merely the ability to take in and retain information and to use it to solve problems, which encompasses a huge range of behaviors seen across many species. Similarly, sapience is often confused with sentience, which is simply the ability to experience sensations, which, again, is applicable to many different animals. The fact is, there is no single coherent definition of sapience, but it can be very generally described as the capacity for cognitive abilities and behaviors comparable to humans, with a species capable of such abilities and behaviors sometimes being called a sophont. But of course, this definition is fundamentally anthropocentric. Why should humans be the gold standard for what counts as sapient? For one thing, alien sophonts would most likely use themselves as the benchmark for sapience. And for all we know, they might have cognition and behaviors so different to our own that by their definition, humans wouldn't qualify as sapient. And for another thing, what does it actually mean for a behavior to be human-like? Centuries of anthropocentrism have fueled the pervasive misconception that there exists a single quintessential trait that separates humans from all other animals, whereas in fact cognition involves innumerable different variables, and it's only relatively recently that behaviors once assumed to be uniquely human have been found to be widespread in the animal kingdom. Not only are many species able to take in more information than humans, with a greater range and acuity of perception, but some also have a better ability to retain that information. African elephants have the spatial memory to recall the relative locations of landmarks spread out over hundreds of kilometers, even decades after visiting them. And corvids like scrub jays and Clark's nutcracker can not only memorize the location and contents of thousands of different food caches, but also the relative time at which they created each of them and even whether or not they were being observed by other birds at the time. Some corvids also show advanced causal reasoning skills and an ability to plan ahead, not only using tools to solve immediate problems, but also storing them in anticipation of future situations that might require them. This so-called mental time travel, the ability to recall the past and envision the future, is even seen in some invertebrates. Some cephalopods have passed tests of delayed gratification, choosing to forgo an immediately available food reward if doing so will provide them with a higher quality food reward at a later point. And Portia spiders are able to plan out the optimal pathway to approach their prey, even if that pathway is longer than the most direct route and takes the spider out of visual contact with their target, suggesting they possess a sense of object permanence. Chimpanzees, humans' closest living relatives, score much higher than humans on certain working memory tasks, suggesting that some areas of human cognition actually diminished on the path to sapience. Even rats have been shown to outperform humans in some cognitive tasks, and pigeons score higher than humans on certain probability puzzles like the Monty Hall problem. All of this indicates that these different aspects of cognition represent wholly separate traits that evolve independently of each other, and that humans, rather than being maximally good at every possible aspect of intelligence, happen to have evolved a particular combination of traits that have led them to develop their civilization in the way they have, implying that an alien sophont could evolve a very different array of traits, and consequently a very different way of interacting with the world around them. But if that's the case, then what criteria should we use to define sapience? One might point out that humans are the only species to make use of technology to alter the environment on a global scale, but there are many species capable of drastically modifying the landscape around them, with perhaps the most noteworthy example being eusocial insects like ants and termites, who employ technologies that rival those of many human societies, including complex architecture, air conditioning, agriculture, domesticated livestock, bridge building, and even rafting, all without any complex thought at all. One could easily imagine a world where one such species reaches the point of completely transforming the entire planet, with vast cities and globe-spanning infrastructure that would be recognizably similar to human civilization, and yet the individual members of this species would be no more sapient than any other animal they shared their biosphere with. Instead, the entire population would collectively act as a single sapient superorganism, just as how individual neurons have no intelligence in and of themselves, but work together to produce a thinking, feeling brain. Would a species like this count as a sophont? If we arbitrarily decide that the answer is no, then we need to identify what distinguishes humans' technological prowess from that of eusocial insects. One major difference is that all of the staggeringly complex feats of engineering that ants and termites perform are innate behaviors, coded directly into their genes and enacted purely instinctively, meaning they don't require any conscious thought and can be carried out from birth like clockwork, while humans have to gradually learn all the skills they need to survive as they grow, Whereas instinctive behaviours take millions of years to evolve, learned behaviours can be acquired within an individual's lifetime, making them more adaptable to short-term changes. The downside is that, since they have no genetic basis, learned behaviours can't be automatically passed on to the organism's offspring, and need to be learned independently by every subsequent generation. Both innate and learned behaviours are found throughout the animal kingdom, and some behaviours can have both instinctive and learned components. But humans excel not only at learning behaviours, but also at inventing new ones in response to situations that they've never experienced before, taking seemingly unrelated ideas and finding connections between them, what might be called creativity or imagination. But even this isn't unique to humans. In a study on Japanese macaques on Kashima Island, in which grains of wheat were scattered along the shore, one particular female worked out how to drop handfuls of sand into water so that the grains floated to the surface, making it much easier to gather them than by picking each one off the ground, a behaviour that soon spread to other members of the troop. In one study, spotted hyenas demonstrated greater cooperative problem-solving abilities than even chimpanzees, taking less than 2 minutes to deduce that simultaneously pulling 2 separate ropes would reveal a food reward, even teaching the solution to other hyenas that were later introduced to the same experiment. Portia spiders have been shown to use a trial-and-error approach to develop new hunting strategies that are each fine-tuned to counter the behaviour of a different species of prey, even in lab experiments that pitted them against artificial prey with behaviours that don't exist in the wild. A few animals even show creative abilities that are possibly on par with those of humans. Many corvids, particularly New Caledonian crows, surpass most primates in their ability to make and use complex tools, and solve puzzles with equivalent proficiency to 8-year-old human children. Elephants also score highly on problem-solving tests, even finding solutions that their human researchers didn't anticipate. They've also demonstrated a grasp of basic arithmetic, achieving similar accuracy to humans in keeping track of the running total of objects added to containers in variable quantities. Similar numerical comprehension has been observed in cetaceans like bottlenose dolphins, who employ creative thinking to invent new hunting techniques, from using sponges as helmets to protect their snouts when foraging on the seabed, to herding shoals of fish by creating curtains of sand and mud to block their path, to using shells as funnels to filter out small prey, to cooperating with teams of fishermen, being one of the only animals capable of some degree of two-way linguistic communication with humans. All of the above animals have also passed the mirror test, one of the most widely used methods for assessing an animal's degree of self-awareness, which involves the animal using a mirror to investigate a mark placed on a part of its body that wouldn't ordinarily be visible to it, indicating that it recognizes its reflection as an image of itself. The only significant difference between the creative behaviours of animals like these and those of humans is the scale at which they're implemented. And keep in mind that all of these species happen to be alive during the present day, and there's no telling how many similarly intelligent species might have evolved over the hundreds of millions of years that multicellular life has existed, suggesting that this level of sapience might not be all that uncommon. Where we choose to draw the line between the behaviours of animals like these and sapience is more or less arbitrary, but to establish a more meaningful distinction than one based on intelligence, we'll coin the term facultative sapience, the ability to create new behaviours and technology to supplement pre-existing survival strategies, while humans are the only known species to have attained what we'll call obligate sapience, being so dependent on creating new behaviours and technologies to modify their environment that they can no longer survive in the wild without them. Based on the fact that it's only evolved one time in the 4 billion years or so that life on Earth has existed, the conditions that favour obligate sapience seem to be quite rare, making it difficult to determine how and why it evolves. Teleological thinking has led to the notion that humans' unique characteristics have come about specifically as pre-adaptations for sapience, and that the humanoid design is the ideal form for all sapient life. But so many aspects of human biology are merely incidental holdovers of their primate ancestry. Humans' long arms and extremely flexible shoulder joints ultimately derive from their arboreal forebears adapting to reach between gaps in the foliage and swing through the treetops, their dexterous grasping hands from the need to securely grab onto branches, Their unusually flat faces and forward-angled eyes from the reduction of snout length in early simians as their sense of smell diminished in favour of the acute vision and spatial awareness necessary for manoeuvring through the canopy. Their lack of a tail from their ancestors evolving the pendulum-like body shape optimal for brachiation, which meant that when Australopithecines later came down from the trees and adopted bipedalism to save energy when travelling over long distances, they had no way of counterbalancing their elevated arms and torso and were forced to assume their unique orthograde posture. And that's not even mentioning the fact that every facet of human anatomy had to be adapted from the ancestral vertebrate body plan, a starting point that an alien Sophont certainly wouldn't share. There's no reason to think that any of these traits would be mandatory for sapiens to evolve, and in fact, the odds of another Sophont independently following exactly the same evolutionary pathway are astronomically unlikely, as evidenced by the fact that none of the facultatively sapient species we brought up earlier are even remotely humanoid. So then, what are the necessary prerequisites for obligate sapience? Again, it's very difficult to say anything with certainty based on our limited sample size, and there are counterexamples to every trend we observe, but we can make some generalized predictions. First of all, since, by the definition we're using, sapience involves learned behaviors, a Sophont will need to be capable of learning in the first place, which, at the most basic level, requires the ability to sense the environment and execute a versatile range of behaviors in response. This means that plants and other sessile organisms are probably out of the running, since their ability to detect and react to stimuli is inherently very limited. But no matter how adept they are at learning, it will unavoidably take an obligate Sophont many years to accumulate the enormous volume of information necessary for a lifestyle that's entirely dependent on technology, which will only be possible for animals with a relatively long lifespan. Lifespan is influenced by many physiological and ecological factors, but the strongest correlate is size, as smaller animals are more vulnerable to predators and other hazards, and so invest in maximizing their fitness in the short term while they still can, rather than gamble on the slim chance they'll survive through multiple breeding seasons, while larger animals can rely on their size for protection, and so can afford to distribute their reproductive efforts over a longer time. We can therefore expect that sapience will be most common in animals of an appreciable, though not necessarily large, body size, probably at least a few kilograms to give them a lifespan lasting multiple years. Although octopuses serve as a notable counterexample, having some of the largest brains and most complex behaviors of any invertebrate despite most species not only being very small, but also semiparous. This is especially surprising because one of the primary mechanisms by which learned behaviors are passed on is by being taught to the next generation, which not only means that obligate Sophonts will necessarily be iteroparous, but also that they'll need a way of transmitting information. In other words, the capacity for culture. Many animals show cultural variation across different regions and populations, including behaviors that don't seem to convey any kind of practical benefit. Some communities of western chimpanzees have been observed throwing rocks at trees so that they accumulate in piles at their base or within hollows in their trunks. And throughout the past few decades, certain pods of orcas have participated in a fad of habitually perching dead salmon on their heads, but the motivations behind both of these behaviors are still unknown. The most common and practical way of transmitting culture is through parental care, since parents will have a vested interest in teaching their young all the behaviors they need to survive to adulthood. Animals with an especially complex repertoire of learned behaviors commonly remain under their parents' care for significant portions of their lives. Elephants, chimpanzees, and humans nurture their young for over a decade, and orcas are the only known species whose young remain with their mother for their entire lives. Prolonged periods of parental care, especially biparental care, will be most strongly selected for in altricial species, as the more helpless the young are at birth, the more they'll rely on their parents to protect them and teach them the skills they need to survive. Plus, the more growth occurs after birth, the greater the extent that brain development will be shaped by learned experiences, leading to a more adaptable range of behaviors, which suggests that sapience might be correlated with altriciality. Although elephants and cetaceans are largely precocial, most corvids and primates tend towards altriciality, with humans being exceptionally so, taking over a year to even learn how to walk, and born with brains only a quarter of the size of the adults that take up to 25 years to complete their development. It's been suggested that this extraordinarily long developmental period may have been influenced by the evolution of bipedalism. As human ancestors evolved narrower pelvises for more efficient bipedal locomotion, it became harder for the ever-enlarging head to pass through the birth canal, a trade-off known as the obstetrical dilemma, for which reason childbirth is a more hazardous ordeal in humans than in almost any other animal. This may have been mitigated by giving birth to increasingly premature young before the head became prohibitively large, so that the majority of brain growth occurs after birth. Of course, this doesn't mean that bipedalism is mandatory for extended developmental periods, as a species can arrive at altriciality by many other pathways. Both long lifespans and parental care are associated with K-selection, which we would therefore expect to be the predominant life history strategy among zoophytes, implying that Sapience is correlated with low fecundity and small clutch sizes, which is corroborated by the fact that humans and most facultatively sapient animals on Earth almost always give birth to only one offspring at a time, with twins and other multiple births being very rare. Considering all of this, it seems unlikely that obligate sapience will evolve among the Lophostomes, since most species have small body sizes, high fecundity, no parental care instincts, and other traits consistent with our selection. On the other hand, both the Xenopsids and the Ramphidonts tend towards K-selection, with parental care being an ancestral trait among both clades and highly altricial young being one of the Ramphidonts' signature characteristics. Along with parental care, a zoophyte will benefit from having as many opportunities to learn new behaviors as possible, not just from their parents, but from other members of their species, meaning they're likely to exhibit sociality. Living in large social groups means that knowledge can be shared and quickly spread through a population, who can all cooperate to modify the environment to a much greater extent than any of them could individually. In fact, sociality may not just go hand in hand with sapience, but actually drive its evolution. Living in a group demands a number of cognitive skills, including a memory sufficient to keep track of all the interactions between group members, the behavioral complexity to coordinate group activities, and in some species a theory of mind, the capacity to understand that other individuals have their own perceptions, emotions, and intentions that are different to one's own, and to imagine the world from another's point of view. There's even some experimental evidence linking sociality with brain size. Humans are able to maintain close personal relationships with a maximum of roughly 150 individuals at a time, a limit known as Dunbar's number, whereas chimpanzees, who have a neocortex about 1/3 the size of humans, have been shown to have an upper limit of about 50 close relationships, which, along with data from other primates, reveals a correlation between degree of sociality and neocortex size. And this trend isn't only present in great apes. Spotted hyenas show similarities to primates not only in the structure and complexity of their social groups, but also in their competence at cognitive tasks and social learning, and there's evidence that the large brain size in cetaceans also evolved in response to the increasing complexity of their social behaviors. All of this lends support to the social intelligence hypothesis, which posits that living in complex social groups selects for the cognitive functions and behavioral adaptability associated with sapience. Although more recent research has identified some confounding factors that we'll get into later, but nonetheless, sociality is an essential precursor for civilization, and will therefore be mandatory for obligate sapience. Again, both the Ramphidonts and Xenopsids have inherited social tendencies from their ancestors, so suitable candidates for sapience could exist among both clades. Just as on Earth, facultative sapience may evolve in several unrelated groups, but for this video, we'll focus on one in particular. By this point, the Dryptognathans will have become a very diverse and successful clade of many hundreds of species, accounting for the majority of carnivorous Ramphidonts, although they'll still be mostly precluded from the niches of large predators from competition with the Xenopsids. Within the patchwork of forests and steppe in the southern tropics, the Dryptognathans will give rise to one particular clade of small social mesocarnivores. While their habitat will offer them plenty of food, it will also be home to an abundance of predators like ceratodonts and peleropsids, so these Dryptognathans will travel together for protection in fission fusion societies of anywhere from 30 to 100 members. They'll also find a degree of protection in spending most of the daylight hours within the shelter of dense vegetation, and will only venture onto the open plains under the cover of darkness. The large eyes and tapetum lucidum they've retained from the ancestral Ramphidonts, granting them the necessary low light vision for a nocturnal or crepuscular lifestyle. To help them navigate the intricacies of group interactions, they'll not only evolve larger, more complex brains, but also increasingly elaborate modes of communication. All extant Ramphidonts have vibrating membranes within their respiratory tracts, which in these Dryptognathans will evolve specialized bones that serve as sites of attachment for vocal muscles to more precisely modulate their calls, like the hyoid bone in Earth's vertebrates, as well as expandable resonating chambers on the side of the cephalothorax that help to amplify their vocalizations. Many social animals also complement their auditory communication with a variety of visual signals. Hyenas and African wild dogs both display complex systems of body language involving the positioning of the ears and tail and overall body posture, as well as specific stances when approaching an individual of higher rank and special ceremonies to greet returning group members. Like many primates, humans use a plethora of autonomic non-verbal signals that are shared across all cultures, including a huge variety of facial expressions, some of which involve specialized muscles that can't be flexed voluntarily, making them inherently honest signals of emotional state. Humans are also the only animals known to shed tears as a response to extreme emotion, as well as one of the few capable of laughter. Human eyes have irises that clearly contrast with their sclerae, making it easy to tell where they're looking and to send subtle signals through eye contact and shifting gaze, an adaptation that also exists to some extent in chimpanzees. All of these cues, along with other aspects of body language, ensure the expression of as much visual information as possible concerning one's attitude and intentions, suggesting that gauging the thoughts and feelings of others was a crucial aspect of social interactions among early humans, which may also be the case for other sophonts. One common signaling mechanism in many mammals is piloerection, the tensing of muscles in the skin to cause the fur to stand on end, which makes the animal appear larger and more imposing to scare off potential threats, a reflex whose vestigial remnants linger in humans as goosebumps. As most dystrophiognathans have a coat of fur, many species may evolve a similar threat display, which these Dryptognathans will augment by evolving longer fur on their cephalothorax and resonating chambers to make the piloerection more apparent, eventually evolving into crests that can be flared out to intimidate rivals and to assert dominance, and adjusting the position and angle of these crests, combined with other subtle aspects of body language, will convey a diverse array of expressions. Since these crests evolve as a means of communication rather than purely as a sexual display, both males and females will sport crests of similar size, shape, and coloration, a feature for which we'll call them astrolophids. But to the astrolophids, smell will be just as important a sense as sight and hearing, as their scavenging habits will demand the ability to detect the stench of carrion over great distances, which will open another avenue of communication. Many species on Earth are equipped with scent glands that produce pheromones and other sociochemicals, many even having different types of scent glands that are each associated with different signals. In social animals, scent is often a key component of group interactions, such as how clans of spotted hyenas each have their own unique scent signature for marking their territory and identifying their members. All osteopods have a set of excretory glands at the base of each of their limbs that filter waste out of the blood. In the astrolophids, the glands on the forelimbs will lose their excretory function and become dedicated scent glands that produce a viscous secretion used to mark territory and communicate health and status. They'll also evolve another pair of scent glands on their upper mandibles that evolve from salivary glands, which will convey more subtle signals relating to mood, familiarity, and sexual availability. As such, scent marking and investigating each other's chemical signals will be primarily accomplished through facial contact, which will therefore be a crucial mode of interaction between group members. A large part of the astrolophid sociality will revolve around their mating system. As is standard for Ramphidonts, ensuring that their exceedingly altricial young survive through their long period of juvenile development, during which they learn all the skills necessary for their independent survival, will require a considerable investment of time and energy from both parents and possibly other members of the social group, which will favour a monogamous mating system and, in some species, cooperative breeding. Within the groves of trees in which they establish their territories, they'll create large communal nest sites where they can collectively care for their vulnerable grubs. Since the females require as much help as possible to raise the young, the most desirable quality that they'll look for in males won't be size, strength, or coloration, but parenting skills, one major element of which will be building and maintaining the nest, which will therefore function as the centerpiece of the male's courtship displays, just as it does in weaver birds, house wrens, and some other bird species. During the breeding season, each male will secure his own patch of the group's territory and construct a nest out of earth, plant matter, and other materials, which the females will use to evaluate the male's worth as a mate, pairing off with the builder of whichever nest they judge to be the best nursery for their young. In time, this behaviour will be exaggerated by sexual selection, with the nests becoming more and more intricate and ornate, involving similar architectural complexity and decoration to that used by male bowerbirds in the construction of their bowers. This will select for greater inquisitiveness and ingenuity to invent new nest-building techniques, which, along with the demands of sociality, will impel them to evolve larger and more adaptable brains. However, while sociality has undeniably played a part in the evolution of sapience, some studies have called its role as the primary driver of higher cognition into question, having identified other factors that correlate with brain size just as closely, the most notable being diet and resource availability. Maintaining a large brain requires a huge amount of energy, so sophonts will benefit from eating calorie-dense foods like meat and fruit, which may be why the massive enlargement of the brain in human evolution coincided with an increased preponderance of meat in their diet. Although then again, elephants have reached their level of facultative sapience despite predominantly feeding on nutrient-poor foods like grass and leaves. On a similar note, it's often speculated that sapience is most likely to occur among predators, since predation, especially pack hunting, generally involves more complex behaviours than other modes of feeding, like judging the right moment to ambush and coordinating hunting strategies between packmates. However, for one thing, complex behaviours can arise from other aspects of life than just feeding behaviours, like sentinel behaviour and other means of predator avoidance. But more importantly, remember that sapience isn't just a matter of behavioural complexity, but of the capacity to learn and invent new behaviours. And as we touched on earlier, learned behaviours don't come about through evolutionary specialisation like innate behaviours do, but instead from a need for behavioural flexibility to cope with variable conditions, which would suggest that sapience is correlated with generalist tendencies, but not so generalist that the species can survive without inventing new behaviours, suggesting a happy medium along the spectrum of specialisation at which sapience will be most strongly favoured. As is typical for dryptognathans, the astrolophids will be mesocarnivores, most species primarily feeding on carrion, malacoforms, and other small prey, occasionally supplemented with seeds and brachyphyte roots, all of which will be processed by the unique hyperarticulated mouthparts common to all dystrophiognathans. But procuring and handling this variety of food will not only involve adaptations to their mouthparts, but also to their forelimbs. Quite possibly the most overstated idea in the discussion of sapience is that all sophonts must inevitably evolve human-like hands to manipulate the environment. But yet again, this line of thinking is woefully teleological. First of all, the ability to handle objects is not at all indicative of sapience, being extremely widespread among all sorts of animals, including species that couldn't be called sapient even by the most generous definition. The evolution of the hand in human ancestors wasn't the fundamental adaptation that made sapience possible, but occurred long before they reached anything even resembling sapience to help them climb trees, and it was only much later that the hands were adapted for tool use. Conversely, lacking manipulatory appendages in no way prevents or inhibits sapience. Dolphins have achieved facultative sapience despite not having any means of manipulation other than their mouths. In short, the ability to grab things has nothing inherently to do with higher cognition. But, all that being said, Obligate sapience, by definition, involves a species reshaping its habitat into an artificial environment that it can't survive outside of, which will only be possible if it has some way of altering its environment in the first place. However, there's no reason to think that a sophont would need a hand to be effective in manipulation. An elephant's trunk is just as versatile, deft enough to pluck a single blade of grass, letting them grip and utilize a variety of tools and with the aid of the tusks lift objects as large as tree trunks, making them extremely effective ecosystem engineers. One of the Ramphadonts' signature traits is the set of digits on their forelimbs, which first evolved in their burrowing Eurychirid ancestors as a way of broadening the foot to make it better able to rip into and scoop away soil, much like the digging claws of mole crickets on Earth. But many Ramphadont clades of the new era have abandoned fossoriality, freeing them to adapt their digits for different purposes. Being predators, the Astrolophids' forelimbs will have adapted for raptoriality, able to fold up against the cephalothorax and dart forward to seize prey, with an enlarged middle digit for grabbing their target and pulling it towards the mouthparts. To permit a more versatile range of manipulatory tasks, this digit will be equipped with a fleshy, sensitive pad to grip against a rounded protuberance at its base, making it suitable for carrying food, nest material, and other objects. Their mouthparts will also aid in manipulation, as the Dystrophiognathon's jaw structure lets the mandibles act as a laterally opposed pair of pincers, and the proximity of the arms and the mouth will allow them to be used together to handle especially large objects, the muscles in the cephalothorax letting them lift heavier loads than the arms could hold alone. The other digits will specialize to assist in feeding. To reach into tight crevices, the inner digit will become slender and hyperextended, tipped with a hooked claw for extracting malacoforms, apodomorphs, and small seeds, while the outer digit will maintain a relatively large, robust claw, used for digging, fending off rivals, and other tasks that might damage the other claws. Another manipulatory task that's very important among many social species is grooming, which not only helps keep their fur clean of dirt, debris, and parasites, but also encourages the formation and maintaining of social bonds. Many mammals, like lemurs, colugos, and tree shrews, have independently evolved tooth combs as an adaptation for grooming, and many primates have a specialized grooming digit called a toilet claw. In the Astrolophids, the claw tipping the middle digit will bear tooth-like serrations that can press against the upper surface of the tactile pad, so that fur can be gripped between them and combed through, much like the split grooming claws on the hind feet of beavers. This can also double as a feeding tool, combing through the gametangial filaments of zygophytes to strain out morsels of food. With all of these adaptations, the Astrolophids will achieve ample success, spreading throughout much of the tropics and radiating into dozens of different species. Being K-selecting, social, and having a moderately generalist but calorie-rich diet, the Astrolophids will meet all of the essential prerequisites for sapience. But yet again, we have to be wary of teleology here. Just because a species fills these requirements doesn't mean that it's somehow destined to reach sapience. After all, there are plenty of species on Earth that tick all of these boxes, and yet only a small handful of them even come close to sapience. Like any other trait, sapience will only evolve if it provides a species with an immediate survival advantage, which, based on what we see on Earth, doesn't seem to occur very often. But there is one major factor that will act as the catalyst for obligate sapience. While physical adaptations and innate behaviors can reach extraordinary degrees of complexity and specialization, they're inherently limited by the speed of evolutionary change, and as such will only be practical if conditions remain stable over long periods. But the more variable and unpredictable a habitat becomes, the more difficult it will be to specialize for, and the greater benefit there'll be in being able to learn and invent new behaviors. Therefore, once all the preceding prerequisites are in place, the final factor required to push a species past the threshold of obligate sapience is an environmental change too rapid to evolve any physiological adaptations or innate behaviors to cope with, but not so rapid that it can't survive and is driven to extinction. A window of time just long enough to invest in a more flexible imagination to let them invent novel solutions to whatever challenges their changing habitat presents. Early hominins had no physical adaptations to deal with the climate fluctuations of the Pleistocene, nor any claws, fangs, or other natural weapons for hunting the megafauna they preyed upon. and so they were forced to compensate by developing tools, clothing, shelters, and other technology. Considering this, it would seem that obligate sapience, far from being the pinnacle of evolutionary advancement, is actually something of a last resort, an extremely circumstantial contingency by which a species can carve out a niche for itself in an environment it has no adaptations for surviving in. This being the case, for the Astrolophids to make the transition to obligate sapience, they'll need to endure a suitably abrupt yet survivable change in conditions. Though the planet will have cooled considerably since the mass extinction, and will continue to cool as the supercontinent drifts further southward, the new era will still be in the midst of a hothouse period, with most of the supercontinent experiencing a perpetually warm and tropical climate, with only the extreme south ever experiencing significant seasonality and climatic variation. Such benign conditions will provide most species with plenty of opportunity to specialize for their habitat, so most Astrolophids won't have much need for sapient behaviors beyond those necessary for their social interactions. But as the southern mountain range continues to rise, the tectonic activity that fuels their growth will eventually trigger a series of intermittent eruption events, which, although not large-scale enough to cause another mass extinction, will still lead to several million years of climatic instability, involving sudden spurts of global cooling as the volcanic emissions increase the planet's albedo. The effects of this climate shift will be most apparent in the far south, which, soon after the eruptions begin, will rapidly become colder and more arid, causing the forests to give way to scrublands and cold deserts, a change too sudden for most species to adapt to, driving many of the inhabitants of the southern regions to extinction. But one particular species of Astrolophid will be just generalist enough to eke out a living as their habitat transforms around them, but not so generalist that they can immediately find a new niche following the transition. With conditions changing so rapidly, they'll only have time to undergo a minimal degree of adaptation, but the one trait that will provide a reliable advantage will be the cognitive capacity to create new survival strategies on the fly, driving them further and further towards obligate sapience, culminating in the emergence of a new genus that we'll call Paleotecton. What few physical adaptations and innate behaviors Paleotecton manages to evolve will mainly serve to help them survive in a colder and more desolate habitat. With the onset of the eruptions, the highlands along the western edge of the mountains where Paleotecton first evolves will be gripped by a cold, semi-arid climate, with huge temperature variation both between day and night and seasonally, the relatively mild summers giving way to long, dry winters with temperatures hovering around freezing, an environment roughly analogous to the Kazakh steppe or the Wyoming basin on Earth. To help them survive through the colder parts of the year, the Paleotecs will become larger and stockier, with a thicker coat of fur to let them conserve a greater amount of body heat. But adapting to this harsh landscape will also demand changes to their feeding and social behaviors. During the summers, this land will be home to big game like teleopsids, anaxotheres, and pachycolaphorans, most of which will migrate north with the approach of winter, when the cryptophytes undergo abscission and the landscape withers into a parched desert. For the Paleotects, the most readily available food sources during the winters will be those below the barren soil, including prey like Eryctochirids, apodomorphs, and estivating xerostricans, as well as tylophyte and cryptophyte bulbs, whose drought-adapted tubers will also serve as a vital source of water. Although malacoforms will still be one of their staple foods, they won't be quite as abundant here as they would be in more fertile areas, so the largest component of the Paleotects' diet will be meat that they obtain through scavenging and pack hunting. The only places that will offer food in any abundance will be the scarce rivers and watering holes that support colonies of drought-resistant vegetation. Such concentrated patches of resources will be ideal places for the Paleotects to form their territories, but the surrounding stretches of barren wastelands will make dispersal a dangerous prospect, which will have major implications for their social dynamics. As covered in Part 12, a high cost of dispersal, along with monogamy and altricial young, are the main factors that select for helpers at the nest and, in extreme cases, reproductive suppression and eusociality. All of these pressures shaped the evolution of the ancestral Ramphidonts, and although many Ramphidont clades in the new era will have reverted to more typical breeding systems, most species will still retain altriciality, monogamy, and a predilection for cooperative breeding, which will predispose them to helpers at the nest and subsequent mating behaviours in environments where the success rate of dispersal attempts is sufficiently low. While the paleotects are very unlikely to become eusocial in the strictest sense, since the extremely high reproductive rates necessary for eusociality go against the K-selecting tendencies associated with Sapience, their hazardous habitat will still discourage offspring from attempting to disperse and reproduce, so they'll instead remain at their home nest to help their parents raise their next clutch of young, resulting in tight-knit family groups or clans where reproduction is monopolized by only a small handful of group members. The average clan will be led by a dominant female or matriarch, along with 1 to 4 other breeding females, all of whom will be closely related and each form an exclusive lifelong pair bond with a single male. Each breeding pair will produce a separate matriline, consisting of multiple generations of their offspring that serve as helpers who provide care to their younger siblings, the whole clan containing anywhere from a dozen to over 100 members, varying with the seasons and with local resource availability. A female's reproductive status will be based on a dominance hierarchy that operates both within and between matrilines, with the matriarch being the highest ranking female of the whole clan. When a female dies, all the females beneath her on the hierarchy will move up in dominance to fill the gap, the death of a breeding female resulting in the most dominant helper being promoted to breeding status to begin her own matriline. This being the case, while the helpers will achieve inclusive fitness from ensuring the survival and reproduction of their relatives, the only way for them to gain direct fitness will be to bide their time until their turn comes to be granted breeding status, a behaviour in cooperative breeding species that's sometimes called queuing. Occasionally, an impatient helper might try to cheat the system by seeking their own mating opportunities, so the matriarch will need to employ reproductive suppression to keep the helpers in line, attacking or evicting those who attempt to reproduce before their turn comes. Their breeding will also be strongly influenced by the seasonality of their habitat. Whereas humans have monthly menstrual cycles and can breed throughout the year, the paleotects will undergo polyestrous cycles in which their fertility fluctuates with the seasons, peaking at the end of the summer so that gestation can occur over the winter months and the grubs can be born in the spring when food becomes relatively abundant again. The mating season will also be the time at which the breeders are most aggressive towards the helpers to discourage them from mating as much as possible. In another big difference to humans, paleotect females will remain fertile throughout their whole lives, while humans are very unusual for experiencing menopause, whereby females undergo a sharp decline in fertility long before the end of their lifespan, which, considering this only serves to limit their direct fitness, would seem to be inherently maladaptive. One commonly held explanation for this is the grandmother hypothesis, which postulates that, in a multi-generational social structure, there comes a point in a female's life at which she gains greater fitness from helping to raise her grandchildren than from continuing her own reproduction. However, even if this is the case, it only seems to hold under a very narrow range of circumstances, as menopause is only known to consistently occur in 4 other species outside of humans, all of which happen to be cetaceans. Like the vast majority of animal species, paleotect females will undergo no such reduction of fertility with age, and in fact, since dominance within the clan is largely based on age, older females will actually have greater reproductive status, with the matriarch typically being the oldest clan member and producing the most populous matriline. Once a female attains breeding status, she'll produce a new clutch of 1 to 2 grubs every few years for the remainder of her 30-year lifespan. But for the males, breeding will be a totally different story. Males won't exhibit the same queuing behaviour as the females, as this would inevitably result in inbreeding. So instead, males will have 2 possible pathways to direct fitness. One will be the protandry they retain from the ancestral ramphidonts, by which males have the possibility of becoming female at some point after they reach maturity. While on average males will be smaller than females, those of sufficient size and aggressiveness to challenge their female nestmates will undergo hormonal changes that cause them to become female, thus inserting them into the female dominance hierarchy and putting them in line to inherit breeding status. Alternatively, however dangerous it might be, a male can achieve reproductive success by dispersing from the safety of his home territory to seek mates elsewhere. In Part 12, we mentioned how in many social species, dispersal rates are higher for one sex than they are for the other, with monogamous species like most birds typically showing female bias dispersal, while in mammals, which are predominantly polygynous, the dispersing sex is almost always the males, with humans and some other primates forming a peculiar exception. Cooperative breeding, on the other hand, is defined by low dispersal rates for both sexes, often without any significant bias towards one or the other. But on the rare occasions when males and females do disperse, they may have different motivations for doing so. Females will typically prefer to remain within their home clan in the hopes of one day inheriting breeding status, but the fierce competition for dominance may force some of the lower-ranking females to abandon any hope of achieving direct fitness within their natal territory, and to disperse in hopes of having better luck elsewhere. In particular, the matriarch will very aggressively enforce her position as head of the clan, and any dissent towards her dominance is likely to be punished with eviction. On the other hand, since the males won't be able to find mating opportunities within their home clan, dispersal will offer much greater benefits for them. But in sequentially hermaphroditic species, the sex ratio tends to be skewed in favour of the initial sex, which, in the case of protandrous clades like the paleotecs and most other amphidonts, means the majority of young will be born male. Fewer females in the population means that males will be less likely to find a mate if they disperse, so they'll only do so after conducting exploratory forays to assess the availability of nearby mating opportunities, either in the form of evicted females travelling through the Badlands or a neighbouring clan in which a breeding male has recently died, leaving the bereaved female available for a new mate. Although the sperm storage mechanisms they retain from their ancestors will allow a female to continue to produce new young after her mate's death until a new and sufficiently fit male presents himself. In the absence of any available females, protandry will once again act as a crucial contingency, allowing some males to become female and choose a mate from among the other dispersing males, after which both will seek out a suitable patch of territory to establish a new clan. Importantly, this social system will have a largely instinctive basis, an extrapolation of the innate behaviours of their astrolophid ancestors, but the adaptation that will be most strongly selected for and constitute the most dramatic change from their ancestors will be a complex enough brain to support an ever-growing range of learned behaviours. Historically, brain size has been regarded as the primary predictor of intelligence, with one of the most commonly used metrics being encephalization quotient, which compares a species' brain size to that of a related species of similar body mass. And while this does serve as a rough indicator of overall intelligence, it doesn't take into account the brain's structure and organization, which contributes to cognition just as much as its size. For instance, the density at which neurons are packed together can belie greater intelligence than what would be expected based on brain size alone. Corvids and parrots owe much of their impressive intelligence to a neuronal density almost double that of primates with similarly sized brains. But even when factoring in neuronal density, some animals are capable of more intelligent behaviours than what their neuron count would suggest. Portia spiders can plan and execute variable hunting strategies despite having a brain only 500,000 neurons large, which is minuscule in comparison to the many billions of neurons that sapient species typically have, suggesting that intelligence can result from other neurological factors. As a further complication, not all animals concentrate the bulk of their central nervous system in a single brain. In many phyla, the function of the brain is filled by multiple nerve clusters or ganglia, which in animals like octopuses means that the different regions of the body can essentially think independently of each other. But regardless of how it's organized, a complex nervous system comes with a hefty energetic cost. Humans expend about 1/5 of their total calorie intake just in maintaining the brain, which once again highlights the importance of energy-rich foods in a sophon's diet, but fueling such a power-hungry organ limits the amount of energy available for other body systems, which might explain the trend in human evolution towards smaller guts, an idea termed the expensive tissue hypothesis, as well as the concurrent reduction in overall muscle density. But as alluded to earlier, sapience may demand not only the sacrifice of physical traits, but also of cognitive traits that aren't directly applicable to sapience. Chimpanzees are not only about 30% stronger than humans, but also have a significantly better short-term memory. which, according to the cognitive trade-off hypothesis, may be due to humans undergoing a reduction in working memory so that as much of the brain as possible could be dedicated towards language, sociality, and other aspects of sapience. In light of this, it may be that one reason why sapience is so rare is that, under the vast majority of ecological circumstances, sapience is actually a detriment, the highly demanding brains and cognitive traits necessary for sapience simply not being worth compromising other aspects of physiology. However, once the right selective pressures are in place, brain complexity can apparently increase very quickly. Within only the last 2 million years, the human brain has tripled in size, the regions undergoing the greatest enlargement being those involved in social interaction, language, and problem solving. Although it's worth noting that for reasons that are still being researched, the last few tens of thousands of years have seen human brain size decrease at an even faster rate, seemingly without any cognitive decline, yet again indicating that brain size isn't the only variable involved in complex cognition. Like vertebrates, polypods have a high degree of cephalization, with a centralized brain within the cephalothorax that tapers into a pair of lateral nerve cords. In Paleotecton, the regions responsible for the cognitive traits necessary for sapience will become more highly developed, the skull and cephalothorax expanding to accommodate them. One of the cognitive skills most likely to be favored is pattern recognition, which is an essential component of the problem-solving capabilities that obligate sapience requires. The human brain has evolved to reward pattern-seeking behaviors by releasing dopamine in response to finding connections among seemingly unrelated or random data points, and facultatively sapient animals also seem to experience a similar pleasure response from solving puzzles. Human pattern recognition even operates on a subconscious level, their natural urge to follow the patterns in rhythm and melody underlying their enjoyment of music, and identifying links between different conceptual domains as a key element of humor. In fact, humans are so hardwired to look for patterns that they often find them where none exist. One common manifestation of this is pareidolia, the tendency to find images and sounds in random stimuli. This is especially true when it comes to faces, since humans communicate so much information through facial expressions that they were selected to discern them even when they have no meaning or intent behind them. Having a similar degree of sociality to humans, the Paleotecs will be keenly perceptive of visual patterns that resemble the crests they use for social signaling, having their own equivalent of facial recognition based around the crests, eyes, and antennae. But humans' knack for finding non-existent patterns and interpreting meaning where there isn't any also makes them quick to jump to conclusions based on whatever they can piece together from available information, often resorting to magical thinking to fill in the gaps in their knowledge, leading them to conceive of superstitions and religions to explain the aspects of the world they can't immediately understand. Another cognitive ability closely tied to this is symbolism, the ability to assign an arbitrary meaning to an object, image, or action so that it represents something else, which is crucial for imagining and communicating ideas independently of present circumstances. Using symbolic behavior, humans are able to convey and understand that a stick figure represents a person, that an arrow indicates direction, and that a thumbs up is a sign of positivity and approval. This ability to derive meaning from abstraction is the foundational principle behind the concept of art, and allows humans to attach significance to cultural customs like stories, currency, fashion, and ceremonial burial. Both pattern recognition skills and symbolic behaviors are key components of the creative thinking that defines sapience, and so are likely to be strongly selected for in all obligate sophonts. But the specific ways in which these cognitive abilities manifest may vary considerably, so that a sophont's appreciation of art, music, and humor, if they even have a recognizable concept of such things, will be based on entirely different criteria to humans. In fact, in the case of the Paleotects, their comprehension of these concepts may originate from an entirely different instinctual starting point to humans, thanks to one particular quirk of their evolution. Even though all the clan's grubs will be raised together in a communal nursery, the male Paleotecs will still retain the instincts for the courtship rituals of their ancestors. But rather than building a nest to attract a female, the male will provide her with a sample of his architectural prowess by moulding the ground of his display patch into an intricate arrangement of shapes and decorative objects, somewhat like the complex circular patterns created by male white-spotted pufferfish during their courtship rituals. As is often the case with sexually selected traits, these structures won't have any kind of practical function, and the female's appraisal of these displays will be based on a purely subconscious preference for certain aspects of shape and design that would seem unremarkable or even unidentifiable to humans. Over time, the instincts that underpin their ability to create and assess these designs will be amplified by sexual selection, improving their capacity for pattern recognition and symbolic behavior, which will not only give them a much more intuitive grasp of geometric relationships and structural engineering than humans, but will also serve as the root of an aesthetic sense for spatial and angular relationships comparable to humans' appreciation of art and music. When it comes to creating the actual nest, unlike most other australophid species, in which males make their own nests individually, in the paleotexts, all the males of the clan will work together to turn their territory into one communal den or fortress. The construction of these fortresses will stem from the same instincts as those of their mating displays, and architectural styles and techniques will vary wildly between different clans, incorporating whatever materials are available within their territory, from walls sculpted from rocks and soil, to palisades and fences formed from the trimmed and interwoven leaves and branches of local plant colonies, to roofs made from layers of animal hide supported by frameworks of sticks and bones. A male's contribution to the construction and maintenance of the fortress will be one of the main determinants of his status within the clan, and so each male will seek to set himself apart from the others by adding some unique personal flair to his handiwork, incorporating curious or eye-catching objects he collects like shiny stones, shells, bones, and vibrant plant structures. This will select for males who not only have a keen grasp of architectural and technological principles, but also the ability to find new uses for objects in their environment, which will feed into the evolution of their sapience. The capacity for symbolism is also a fundamental precondition for the development of language, which requires the association of meanings with arbitrary sequences of sounds and images. While all social species employ some form of communication, only a few exhibit anything comparable to human language in having underlying grammar and an ability to express an effectively infinite range of concepts. Honeybees use what's called a waggle dance to communicate the distance and direction of flowers, prairie dog alarm calls convey detailed visual descriptions of approaching threats, including their size, speed, species, color, and other specific details of their appearance, and dolphins coordinate group activities with a highly complex series of whistles, each member of the pod using a unique signature whistle that serves to identify them in the same way as a name, and they can also be taught to understand gestural languages devised by human researchers. When and how language first developed in human ancestors, or even whether it emerged only once or multiple times, is still unknown. But in any case, the neurological underpinning that makes language possible has clearly been strongly selected for over the course of human evolution, as evidenced by the fact that the temporal lobe, which houses the centers of language processing, has undergone a greater degree of expansion in the last few million years than almost any other part of the brain. This isn't too surprising considering that language massively increases the volume of information that can be expressed in social interactions, hugely facilitating the sharing and passing down of knowledge essential for sapience, and has therefore become one of the most critical elements that makes human society possible. The paleotext languages will develop from the simpler avenues of communication used by their ancestors, the vocalizations that have been a fundamental means of communication throughout the Australophid's history serving as the basis for spoken language, much of which will be informed by the anatomy of their vocal and hearing organs. Human ears can typically pick up sounds between about 20 to 20,000 Hz, but are especially sensitive to sounds within about 2 to 5,000 Hz, the band of frequencies at which speech usually occurs. And there's even some evidence that hominin hearing evolved to become more sensitive to these frequencies alongside the development of language. But the paleotext vocalizations will primarily occur at higher frequencies, which will also likely be the range to which their hearing is most attuned, meaning they wouldn't be able to hear the differences between many of the sounds used in human languages. To the paleotexts, human speech would sound like an indiscernible garbled mess, nor would humans be able to distinguish the key distinctions in paleotext vocalizations, and the two species could never understand one another's speech without the aid of specialized instruments. but the Paleotech's spoken languages will be complemented by olfactory signals communicated in a complex alphabet of sociochemicals, and many cultures will also use sign languages involving movements of the forelimbs, antennae, and crests. While language and symbolic behaviour will help them envision and communicate new ideas, tool use will be a crucial means of executing those ideas and bringing them into tangible reality. Yet again, tool use isn't at all exclusive to sophonts, but is seen across a huge range of clades, most often involving using a natural object to assist in a particular task, such as how otters and Egyptian vultures use rocks to break open food items. But a handful of species, most notably corvids and great apes, are able to modify objects to make them better suited to the task they're being used to accomplish, and even combine multiple different components into compound tools. In some cases, tool use is an innate behaviour, such as how woodpecker finches instinctively use twigs to probe for insects among crevices in trees, while in others it needs to be learned, like how some populations of orangutans have learned to use leaves to modulate their calls to make them sound larger and more threatening. While tool use isn't unique to sophonts, the greater ability to manipulate the environment that it provides does facilitate the transition to obligate sapience. Tool use in human ancestors goes back at least 3 million years, and rapidly developed to the point of becoming indispensable for their survival. The Paleotechs will undertake the first steps in this transition as a byproduct of the male's nest-building behaviours, using stones as anvils, cutting edges, and chisels to aid in the construction of their fortresses and to help them design more elaborate and ornate courtship displays. But it won't be long before they begin to extrapolate these principles to find ways of using tools to gather food more efficiently, creating digging tools to assist in searching for tubers and fossorial prey, and constructing rings of stones within the shallows of rivers and lakes to confine acanthopods, like the fish traps that innumerable different cultures on Earth have used for thousands of years, some of which are among the oldest known archaeological sites on Earth. Tools will also be a crucial force multiplier by which the Paleotechs can compensate for their lack of strength and natural weapons, letting them hunt prey much larger than they could tackle ordinarily by fashioning rocks, sticks, and bones into spears, axes, and other weapons. Their sexually selected urge to constantly innovate and discover new ways of modifying their environment may even lead them to find ways to control and create fire. While there are a few known instances of non-human animals using fire, such as kites and brown falcons that collect burning sticks during wildfires and use them to spread the flames to flush prey into the open, humans are the only animals to have learned to create fire. Tentative evidence for the controlled use of fire in humans goes back over 1 million years to early hominins like Homo erectus, and was a critical precursor for much of their later technology. For the Paleotechs, fire will be a crucial means of keeping warm, the desiccated vegetation during the long dry winters serving as ideal kindling, but they'll also make ample use of it as a weapon in hunting, wielding flaming sticks and torches to drive prey into areas of hazardous terrain like cliff edges and narrow passes. However, despite their technological prowess, one category of tool that the Paleotechs will notably lack is thrown weaponry. As a legacy of their arboreal ancestors, humans have extremely flexible arms, dexterous hands, and binocular vision, all of which made them pre-adapted for throwing projectiles, providing a way of hunting large and dangerous prey from a safe distance once they became ground-dwelling predators, which selected for modified arm bones and improved hand-eye coordination to make them as proficient with ranged weaponry as possible. While there are other animals that employ ranged attacks, like archerfish, and some species like chimpanzees and other primates are known to occasionally throw things, humans are capable of throwing faster and with greater accuracy than any other animal. However, nothing in the Paleotech's evolutionary history will have given them the same kind of forelimb flexibility, so they won't be capable of throwing anything with the speed or force necessary to significantly wound their prey, so they'll instead use close-ranged weapons as their most common hunting tools. On a similar note, early humans owed much of their success to persistence hunting, with adaptations in their bones and muscles helping them maintain stamina over long distances, letting them pursue prey for hours on end until it succumbs to exhaustion. This is complemented by a higher density of eccrine sweat glands than any other mammal, and a reduced covering of fur so sweat can evaporate more easily, keeping them cool during the intense exertion of keeping up with their quarry. However, the Paleotechs are adapted to chase their prey only over short distances, and will only travel far from their territory when absolutely necessary, and so will instead rely much more on ambush tactics. Fortunately for them, prey will naturally be drawn to the watering holes and patches of vegetation that they establish their territories around, letting them use and modify the surrounding landscape to aid in their hunting strategies, constructing pit traps that prey is funneled into by carefully positioned walls and fences, or even containing prey within enclosures, which may one day lead to the development of domestication. As the Paleotechs develop a larger and larger scope of behaviours over a period of several million years, their ever-expanding brains, along with other incidental adaptations that occur along the way, will eventually reach a degree of differentiation from their ancestors to result in the emergence of a new genus, one that we'll call Neotecton, who will take their ancestors' technological sophistication to a level where they can no longer survive without it, at which point they'll have completed the transition to obligate sapience, and with their ability to modify their environment to suit their needs, they'll achieve an unprecedented level of success. Once an obligate sophont develops technologies that allow it to survive independently of environmental conditions, it will no longer be restricted to any particular region or habitat, and the need to provide resources for its growing populations will inevitably force it to spread across the planet. Although the majority of hominin genetic diversity has remained concentrated in Africa where they first evolved, humans have undertaken many multitudinous waves of migration over the last 2 million years, and have spread to every corner of the globe, even remote islands thousands of kilometers from the mainland. Each of these migrations occurred over only a few tens of thousands of years, a timescale far too rapid for the biotas they invaded to adapt to, which, along with the unstable climate of the younger Dryas, was the main cause of the late Pleistocene extinctions, with the arrival of humans into most regions being immediately followed by a 60 to 80% reduction in local megafaunal diversity. The Neotechs, however, are nowhere near as nomadic as early humans, so their colonization of the planet will be comparatively slow, although still very fast on the timescale of evolution. And despite the eruptions in the southern mountains, the hothouse period that their planet is currently undergoing will be much less hostile than the Ice Age climate that exacerbated the late Pleistocene extinctions, meaning the early Neotechs' impact on the environment won't be quite as severe as humans, although they're still likely to cause considerable ecological disruption in the areas they colonize. Eventually, the Neotechs will manage to disperse into every available habitat across the supercontinent, a process that will occur gradually enough for them to diverge into many different species along the way. However, if human history is any indication, most of these descendant species will be short-lived. Of the 20 or so species of hominins, Homo sapiens is the sole living representative, and even then, the last common ancestor of every living human outside of Africa today is believed to have left Africa within only the last 70,000 years, with all of the other migrations over the past 2 million years leaving behind no descendants. It's still not known how much the relative success of Homo sapiens is due to them actively outcompeting and interbreeding with the other species and driving them to extinction, or if the bigger factor was simply the harsh climate of the late Pleistocene that the others were unable to endure. Again, the relatively hospitable climate during the Neotechs migrations will give them a marginally higher success rate than those of early humans, and while Paleotecton and most species of Neotecton will eventually die out, a select few species will achieve long-term success. The first species of Neotect, which we'll call Neotecton ativus, will spread northward from the southern steppe and establish a presence in the tropics, from which will arise many new species. This will be a very different environment to the one in which their ancestors evolved, so over several 100,000 years, some populations will adapt to become slightly more tolerant of hotter climates, with longer, thinner limbs and smaller, more gracile bodies with a lighter coat of fur, resulting in a new species that we'll call Neotecton gracilis. But one final species will emerge around 100,000 years later within the eastern plains, and it will be this species, whether by sheer luck or by some slight adaptive or technological advantage, that will find the greatest success and go on to colonize the majority of the planet, for which reason we'll name them Neotecton ecumenes. The competition from Neotecton ecumenes will force the others into decline, but Neotecton gracilis and perhaps a few other species will still survive, at least for a time, in small isolated pockets in the far reaches of the supercontinent, while Neotecton acumenes will proliferate across the entire globe and proliferate into thousands of ethnicities and cultures, their technology letting them exert an ever greater command over their environment as they do so. But no matter how capable a Sophont is of learning new behaviours and adapting to new circumstances, no matter how far its culture and technology progresses, it will always be tethered to some extent to the innate behaviours of its ancestors, as technological and societal developments occur over such an absurdly rapid timescale in comparison with the rate of evolutionary change that the species' instincts can't adapt fast enough to keep up, and will be maintained even after they become obsolete or maladaptive, a phenomenon for which we'll coin the term instinctual lag. Humans would certainly like to think of themselves as being in full control over their own thoughts and behaviours, and as wholly rational creatures that are totally divorced from the natural world, but in reality, much of human psychology is beholden to pre-programmed instincts that directly result from the ecological circumstances under which their ancestors first evolved. Homo sapiens only evolved about 300,000 years ago, and all of recorded history has only occurred within the last 5,000 years, a period of time far too brief to allow any significant genetic changes to occur, meaning the innate behaviours that evolved in response to the pressures faced by early humans still persist, despite the fact that technological and cultural advancements have completely eliminated many of those pressures. For example, the struggle for dominance within the social group selected for humans to react with aggression when they perceive their status as being challenged, which can be triggered in modern humans even in situations in which hostility is entirely irrational or counterproductive. When they overcome a competitor, humans also feel a sense of triumph for asserting their dominance, an emotional reward so alluring that modern humans create and engage in artificial contests like competitive sports and other games, which, although completely unnecessary and inconsequential for their survival, still provide the thrill of victory thanks to instinctual lag. When faced with danger, modern humans also still exhibit the same fight or flight response as early humans, marked by an elevated heart rate, increased blood pressure, and hyperventilation in anticipation of the physical demands of fending off an opponent or escaping danger, despite the fact that these physiological responses aren't helpful at all in tackling the types of stress-inducing situations that modern humans usually deal with. Of course, technological and cultural developments can do a lot to change a Sophont's behaviours from their ancestral state, but some traces of their evolutionary history will always remain, and the Neotecs will be no exception. At the most basic level, a Sophont's psychology will be shaped by its senses. Humans are very visually oriented animals, having inherited keen eyesight from their primate ancestors, most notably when it comes to colour vision. While birds and reptiles typically have 4 different types of colour-receptive cone cells, most mammals only have 2, which may be a vestige of their early nocturnal ancestors prioritizing night vision over colour vision. But primates are some of the only mammals to have separate cones for red, blue, and green light, which they may have evolved to help them spot brightly coloured fruit in the forest canopy. However, this has come at the expense of their night vision, and consequently, humans are very strongly diurnal animals, with fear of the dark being a near universal human experience, and darkness being associated with evil across virtually all cultures. On the other hand, the Neotects, having evolved from predominantly nocturnal ancestors, will have much more acute night vision than humans, and thus have no such fear of darkness. If anything, the bright sunlight of midday might elicit an agoraphobic response, signalling the time at which the diurnal predators are most active. Meanwhile, their colour vision will be limited to hues of yellow and blue, which will also influence how they conceptualize their surroundings. To human eyes, red tends to stand out more than other colours in most environments, and so is commonly used to signify danger, urgency, or simply importance. But not only can the Neotects not distinguish red from green, but the pigmentation of the chemophytes will give most terrestrial environments a red backdrop, making it a much more neutral colour for them. However, bright blue and green are the colours most frequently used in aposematic displays, particularly in poisonous malacoforms like the chloroderms and cyanoderms, which the Neotects' malacovorous ancestors would have evolved to avoid, so they may associate this range of colours with danger. In fact, particular hues of bright blue and green, arranged in patterns that resemble those of especially poisonous malacoforms, may even provoke an innate disgust or fear response. This aversion to certain visual stimuli isn't unprecedented. Tropical birds raised in captivity have been observed to instinctively avoid bands of colour that resemble those of coral snakes, despite having never seen coral snakes before. And there's even some tentative evidence that humans are disproportionately quick to notice elongated serpentine shapes, which has controversially been suggested to be the vestiges of an instinct to recognize and avoid venomous snakes, the so-called snake detection hypothesis. In contrast to their keen vision, most primates have a relatively poor sense of smell, especially humans, whose olfactory bulbs have undergone severe reduction over the course of their evolution. But for the neotexts, smell contributes just as much as sight to the sensory tapestry from which they derive their understanding of the world. Their scent markings will provide a record of the health, status, mood, and familiarity of those around them, acting like olfactory name tags on everything within the clan's territory, which will inform how they conceptualize identity and ownership of property. When it comes to taste, human ancestors, like many other primates, evolved a high proportion of sweet receptors to encourage them to seek out the sugar-rich fruit that formed a crucial component of their diet, which, thanks to instinctual lag, means that modern humans still crave sugar despite their technology allowing them to produce and obtain it in excessive and unhealthy quantities. The neotexts, on the other hand, don't derive much of their nutrition from frugivory, and so much like cats, hyenas, seals, and other predominantly carnivorous animals, will have no sensitivity to sweetness, instead having taste receptors that detect chemicals present in meat. But one of the aspects of their biology that will have the greatest influence over the development of their cultures will be their reproduction, the distinction between breeders and non-breeders being viewed as a critically important division that permeates every facet of society. Having children won't be seen as a right or an expectation like it is in many human societies, but as a privilege available only to those who've earned breeding status, which will be considered a huge life accomplishment that the helpers will aspire to achieve during their lifetime. For the non-breeders, especially the females, any display of sexual interest will be extremely taboo, and interpreted as a challenge to the breeder's dominance. Since dominance is strongly correlated with age, most cultures will be very reverent of their elders, even after they pass the peak of physical health. The breeders will be responsible for duties relating to government, politics, and managing affairs between clans, while the non-breeders will be responsible for domestic tasks, assigned duties according to their individual aptitudes, including hunting, foraging, fighting, and caring for the grubs. Looking after the grubs will be a collective effort, the preponderance of males among the helpers leading to child-rearing being seen as a chiefly masculine task, and since the breeders play a minimal role in looking after the young, the grubs will form no stronger of an emotional bond with their parents than with any other member of the clan. As a way of motivating the helpers to tend to the young, traits associated with juveniles will provoke an instinctive urge to provide care. Humans are so susceptible to the so-called baby schema, marked by a disproportionately large head and eyes and overall rounded features, that even non-human babies can trigger it. However, the blind and practically boneless grubs of the neotexts will lead the helpers to evolve nurturing instincts triggered by soft, worm-like bodies with short limbs and small or absent eyes, in which case they might regard animals like the neotenic apodomorphs and some of the brachyschelids with the same degree of cuteness that humans do with puppies and kittens. The queuing behaviour by which helpers earn breeding status will also shape their cultural organisation. Like their primate relatives, human ancestors lived in societies with high levels of mate competition and flexible dominance hierarchies that were constantly rearranged as group members vied with one another for higher rank, which selected for instincts that manifest in modern humans as a drive to continuously advance their status, reputation, and wealth, and to make themselves appear as attractive and enviable as possible. As such, humans are extremely attentive to how they're perceived by others, reacting with aggression when their social standing is challenged and embarrassment when their public image is tarnished. In the Neotet clans, however, social mobility is much more limited, as dominance among the females is almost entirely a function of age, so jockeying for higher status would be interpreted as a challenge to the established order that would be met with disapproval and condemnation from the other clan members, and in some cases would be punishable by eviction. Instead, the most reliable way for a neotect to gain status will simply be to wait for a gap to open in the hierarchy, rewarding those who are patient and obedient, content to only accept material possessions that are necessary or befitting of their station. Their view of sex and gender will be strongly shaped by their protandry, conceptualized as an outgrowth of one's personality and not the other way around, and the fact that males can become female, but not vice versa, will imbue gender with a directionality that corresponds to life stage and maturity. Masculinity and femininity won't be thought of as contrasting or mutually exclusive concepts, or as occupying opposite ends of a spectrum, but rather masculinity will be seen as the default or expected state, especially among juveniles and helpers, while femininity will be seen as a modification upon masculinity, a quality that's attained over the course of one's life, achieved only by those with sufficient strength, determination, and discipline, with the relatively few grubs who are born as females being seen as prodigies, displaying readiness for leadership from birth. And since they'll have no way of understanding how or why the change from male to female occurs, it will likely be the subject of magical thinking in many cultures, who may attribute it to the will of a higher power that has specifically chosen the individual to one day rule the clan. Although strength, courage, and tenacity will be seen as admirable feminine qualities, females will also be expected to meet very high standards of subservience to the breeders, or else face the shame of being disowned by their clan, and as such they'll have a greater investment than males in upholding and enforcing the clan's traditions and cultural precepts. Whereas females will tend to be conformist and authoritarian, males will have a greater drive for novelty and innovation, having a natural urge to reshape their living spaces into exhibitions of their individuality, which will be a ubiquitous and vital means of self-expression. Architecture, civil engineering, and urban planning will be viewed as highly respected masculine art forms, to the extent that many elements of the structure and organization of human cities would seem bleak and utilitarian to them. As their ancestors were so dependent on their territories and so rarely ventured into the perilous wastelands beyond, they'll have a much greater sense of place attachment than humans and be more hesitant to travel far from home, especially the females, since ordinarily they only depart from their territory if rejected by the matriarch and expelled from the dominance hierarchy, causing them to experience intense stress if separated from their clan for prolonged periods. The female's queuing behavior will naturally lead to matrilineal descent in most cultures, the ownership of property passed down through the female line. The males, on the other hand, can't rely on inheritance to earn wealth or status, so for them, leaving their home clan will present an opportunity to garner wider renown and find mating opportunities. Whereas a female leaving her home clan will be considered a mark of shame, in males it will be seen as ambitious and enterprising, and in many societies, exchanging males between clans will serve to establish alliances and be a common component of trade agreements. Of course, there will be countless thousands of cultures that emerge as the neotech spread across the planet, each one with different customs according to their environment and their specific history, but all of them will adapt their behaviors from this same instinctual foundation. But one byproduct of instinctual lag that all of their cultures will certainly have in common is a sense of morality. The success of any social group will depend on the cooperation of all of its members, who will therefore be selected to behave altruistically towards each other and to develop strong bonds of empathy with one another, especially among family members, since, as Hamilton's rule describes, the inclusive fitness gained from an altruistic act is directly proportional to the degree of relatedness between the individuals involved. Inevitably, however, there will always be some who try to cheat the system by contributing as little as possible while taking advantage of the other group members' efforts. Such selfishness will pose a danger to the whole group, so cooperation will need to be enforced by punishing or exiling those who don't pull their weight. These social instincts form the basis of morality, with behaviors that contribute to the success of the group forming a conception of goodness, encompassing virtues like compassion, temperance, and diligence, whereas the concept of evil is derived from selfish behaviors that benefit the individual at the expense of the group, like greed, negligence, hatred, and especially murder, and the drive to discourage and punish such evil acts results in a notion of justice and vengeance. This basic moral framework is likely to be universal among sophonts, as it naturally arises from the instincts necessary for a functioning social system, although there may be some variation in what behaviours are seen as good or evil based on how the group dynamic operates. For instance, in the case of the Neotects, the distribution of resources in their ancestors' habitat meant that collectively caring for the offspring of only a few breeding pairs was ultimately the best way to guarantee fitness for everyone in the clan, so having children without the explicit approval of the rest of the group may be considered an act of evil, or at least selfishness. However, while the evolution of sociality provides the foundation for morality and cooperation, paradoxically, it's also responsible for some of the most dangerous and lamentable aspects of human nature. Evolution only incentivizes altruism between organisms with sufficient relatedness or who live in close enough association with each other for acts of altruism to be reciprocated. In other words, morality will only be upheld among members of the same social group, whereas there's no evolutionary impetus to extend any goodwill to those outside the group, who only represent a source of competition. Therefore, social species will face a strong pressure to distinguish their in-group from their out-group, to sort the others around them into categories of us versus them, selectively applying empathy only to the former while reacting to the latter with aggression. One way of distinguishing group membership is by physical appearance, as the high degree of relatedness within a group will result in some measure of family resemblance, whereas outsiders will have a distinct genetic history that will likely leave some apparent visual differences, the instinct to selectively apply or withhold empathy based on these differences forming the origin of xenophobia and racism. Alongside this, the need to protect the group's local resources from rivals selects for an instinct to define one's in-group based on territory, only extending bonds of solidarity to those within a largely arbitrary boundary, while viewing those beyond it as being fundamentally different, which surfaces in modern humans as patriotism and nationalism. Humans also distinguish their in-group from their out-group based on ideology, deriving a large part of their identity, especially their affiliation with their in-group, from their beliefs, and naturally associating more readily with individuals who share similar opinions and perspectives. One would think it would be adaptive for a sophont to be willing to revise and update their worldview in response to new information, and to welcome the prospect of encountering beliefs that differ from their own, the resulting exchange of ideas allowing them to form a more accurate understanding of the world. But the in-group biases around which human psychology is orientated means that, as much as humans pride themselves on their grasp of logic and reason, they all too often fall victim to thought traps and irrational thinking. Being so protective of their ideology makes them highly susceptible to belief perseverance, maintaining a belief despite being presented with evidence that contradicts or invalidates it, which is exacerbated by the pattern-loving instincts mentioned earlier, their compulsion to find significance even in randomness making them prone to confirmation bias, only taking account of data points that support what they already believe and ignoring those that don't fit their preconceptions, by which they can become entirely convinced of claims and notions that are completely unsubstantiated. This conceptual inflexibility is so hardwired into the human brain that having one's core beliefs challenged activates the same neural pathway as an external threat, and can consequently trigger an aggressive response. This instills a fear of being rebuked for holding beliefs or opinions that differ from the rest of the in-group, and promotes a desire to be seen as like-minded with those around them, resulting in herd mentality and ideological homogenization. Although these impulses have long since become vestigial in modern humans, instinctual lag means that they persist regardless, and pose an ever-increasing threat to the success and longevity of human civilization. The alienation and vilification of the outgroup cultivating intolerance and conflict, the drive to accumulate wealth and status for oneself and one's in-group at the expense of others manifesting as greed and overexploitation of the environment, the devotion to their convictions motivating the rejection of scientific and rational thought in favour of blind loyalty to ideological allegiances. Regrettably, these instinctual hang-ups seem to be an inescapable byproduct of the evolution of sociality, meaning they may well be common among obligate sophonts throughout the universe. In fact, since the ultimate root of the us versus them mentality is competition for resources, We can speculate that the greater the resource scarcity in the environment in which a Sophont first evolves, the greater the extent that their psychology will revolve around in-group versus out-group biases, with the proviso that habitats where resources are particularly abundant probably won't be conducive to the evolution of sapience in the first place. In this regard, the Neotects are at something of a disadvantage, as their social structure evolved in response to the patchy distribution of resources across the otherwise barren habitat in which the Paleotects first evolved, selecting for a high degree of territoriality and hostility towards other clans, which is very likely to hinder their cooperation and societal development. Indeed, cooperative breeding, and especially eusociality, are correlated with high levels of aggression between groups. Meerkats have the highest death rate from intercolonial violence of any mammal, and ants and termites typically kill any individual they encounter whose scent they don't recognize, and colonies in proximity to one another frequently end up wiping each other out. Just like humans, the Neotects' history will be rife with war, prejudice, exploitation, and bloodshed, a tragic legacy of their evolutionary history, and one that perhaps all sapient life will need to contend with, possibly even acting as the so-called Great Filter that prevents life from being more common in the universe, for it may be that all too often Sophonts end up destroying themselves. However, the Neotects' intelligence and imagination will also let them find ways around conflict, like negotiation and bartering, culminating in the establishment of trade networks by which different clans form alliances and eventually aggregate into unified societies, which will allow technological innovations to spread among larger populations and knowledge to be more efficiently circulated, preserved, and passed on to future generations. Within the next few tens of thousands of years, the Neotects will come to a critical turning point in their history. Constrained by instinctual lag, they can't rely on evolution to help their instincts keep pace with their cultural development, and while their technological advancement will let them increase the efficiency with which they can provide food and shelter to their populations and improve their standards of health, security, and overall quality of life, it will also heighten their capability to wage war and irreparably damage the planet around them, so that should they succumb to the obsolete impulses of their ancestors, they have the potential to unleash destruction on a scale even greater than the mass extinction that ended the previous era. Ultimately, the Neotects' survival will depend on them coming to understand themselves, their own evolutionary story and that of the biosphere around them, and resolving to confront and change their own nature, abandoning their selfishness, greed, and intolerance, and letting curiosity, empathy, and altruism guide them to a peaceful and prosperous future. But whether or not they'll succeed, only time will tell. And so at last we come to the end of our long journey. I'd like to give a tremendous thank you to anyone and everyone who contributed to this series, including, but not limited to, all the artists on Discord, whose submissions have helped cut down the production time of these videos by an enormous margin and make them far more visually interesting than I could possibly do on my own. And of course, all the patrons, whose incredible generosity has made it possible for me to work on these videos full-time for almost 5 years. This has been, without any shred of doubt, the single biggest and most ambitious project I've ever worked on, and there's no way I would have been able to see it through to its completion without all of your help and support. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.